The October sun painted the Texas sky in golden hues as George Strait drove his pickup truck down the dusty dirt road leading to the ranch where he grew up. After decades of tours, recording studios, and sold-out arenas, the silence of this place seemed almost deafening. At 71 years old, the king of country music felt the weight of a career that had taken him to the highest peaks of music, but had also kept him away from his origins for long periods. The fences needed repairs, the paint on the main house was peeling, and the old oak tree where he used to sit and play guitar as a teenager had grown even more majestic with time. George parked the truck near the front porch and sat for a moment, letting memories wash over him like waves against the shore. "Daddy would have wanted this place kept better," he murmured to himself, stepping out of the vehicle. The familiar creak of the wooden steps under his boots brought back countless memories of running up and down these same steps as a child, chasing after his siblings or hurrying to help his father with the daily chores. The house had been empty for 3 years now, ever since his stepmother Dorothy had moved to a retirement community in San Antonio. George had been meaning to come back and decide what to do with the property, but tour schedules and recording commitments always seemed to get in the way. Now, with a rare break in his calendar, he finally had the time to face this piece of his past. Walking through the front door, George was hit by the musty smell of a house that had been closed up too long. Dust particles danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the windows, and everything seemed smaller than he remembered. The living room, where his father, John Byron Strait, used to sit every evening, reading the newspaper and listening to the radio, looked frozen in time. George moved slowly through the rooms, each one triggering a flood of memories. The kitchen, where his mother Doris had cooked countless meals before the divorce when he was just 10 years old. The small bedroom he had shared with his brother John Jr., where they would whisper late into the night about their dreams and plans for the future. The back porch, where his father would sit on Sunday afternoons, strumming an old guitar and humming melodies that George had never heard anywhere else. "I should have come back sooner," George whispered to the empty house, his voice echoing in the silence. He had always told himself he was too busy, that there would be time later. But now, standing in the hallway where his father had measured his height with pencil marks on the doorframe, he realized how much time had already slipped away. The grandfather clock in the corner had stopped working years ago, its hands frozen at 3:17. George remembered his father winding it every Sunday morning without fail, a ritual as constant as the sunrise. The silence where the steady tick-tock used to be felt profound, like a heartbeat that had stopped. As he moved toward the staircase leading to the second floor, George's eyes fell on a family photograph hanging on the wall. It showed him at 16, holding his first real guitar, standing between his father and stepmother Dorothy. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, and there was pride in John Byron Strait's eyes that George had perhaps taken for granted at the time. "You never got to see how far it all went, Dad," George said softly to the photograph. His father had died in 2009, long after George had become a household name, but somehow George felt like he had never truly shared his success with the man who had first put a guitar in his hands. The wooden stairs creaked familiarly under his weight as he climbed to the second floor. The hallway was narrower than he remembered, with faded wallpaper that his stepmother had put up in the 1980s. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs and a small bathroom with a window that looked out over the pasture where they used to keep cattle. George pushed open the door to his old bedroom and was surprised to find it much as he had left it decades ago. A single bed with a faded blue quilt, a small wooden desk where he used to do homework, and in the corner an old cassette player where he had listened to Hank Williams, Merle Haggard, and George Jones records until he knew every word by heart. But it was the access to the attic that caught his attention. The wooden panel in the ceiling had a cord hanging from it, and George remembered his father telling him as a child that the attic was off limits because it was full of old junk and probably mice. Now, as an adult with his own children grown and moved away, George felt a curiosity he had never allowed himself to indulge as an obedient boy. He pulled the cord, and the panel opened with a groan of old hinges. A wooden ladder unfolded, and despite the dust that rained down on him, George climbed up into the attic space. The air was stifling and filled with the scent of old wood and forgotten things. Shafts of light filtered through small vents, illuminating cobwebs and cardboard boxes stacked in corners. Most of the boxes contained what his father had accurately described as old junk. Christmas decorations from the 1970s, clothes that had gone out of style decades ago, and farm equipment manuals for machinery they no longer owned. But in the far corner, hidden behind a larger box, George found something that made him pause. It was a small wooden chest, handmade and worn smooth by years of handling. George had never seen it before, which struck him as odd, since he thought he knew every inch of this house. The chest wasn't locked, and when he opened it, he found treasures that took his breath away. There were old photographs of his father as a young man, some showing him playing guitar in what looked like honky-tonk bars. There were sheet music pages covered in his father's handwriting, with chord progressions and lyrics scribbled in the margins. And at the bottom of the chest, wrapped in an old bandana, was a leather-bound journal with John B. Strait, Private, written on the cover in his father's distinctive script. George's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the journal. He had never known his father to keep a diary. John Byron Strait had been a man of few words, practical and hard-working, not someone who seemed inclined toward writing down his thoughts. Yet here was evidence of an inner life that George had never suspected. He carefully climbed down from the attic, carrying the chest with him, and sat on his old bed to examine his discovery more closely. The photographs showed a side of his father he had never known existed. In one, John Byron couldn't have been more than 25, standing on a small stage with a guitar, his hair slicked back and wearing the kind of Western shirt that country performers wore in the 1950s. There was a confidence in his posture, a stage presence that George recognized from his own performing days. The sheet music was even more revealing. These weren't songs that George recognized, which meant his father had been writing original material. The lyrics spoke of longing, of dreams deferred, of loving someone so much that you'd give up everything for their happiness. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, showing that these weren't casual jottings, but serious compositions that had been worked over and refined. But it was the journal that held the most promise and the most fear. George knew that reading it would be crossing a line, invading his father's privacy even in death. But he also sensed that within those pages might be answers to questions he had never known he needed to ask. The first entry was dated December 3rd, 1962, just a few months after George was born. "My son came into this world yesterday," it began in his father's neat handwriting. "Norma Sue and I decided to name him George Harvey Strait II, after his grandfather. He's got strong lungs and tiny fists that grab onto everything. Looking at him, I see all the possibilities in the world. I want to give him everything I never had, every chance I never got." George felt a lump forming in his throat as he read those words. His father had never been openly emotional, never one for long speeches about feelings or dreams. Yet here, in private, John Byron Strait had poured out his heart onto paper. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the bedroom windows, casting long shadows across the floor. George realized he had been sitting in the same spot for over an hour, holding his father's journal but afraid to read further. Whatever secrets these pages contained, he sensed they would change something fundamental about how he understood his family, his childhood, and perhaps even himself. Outside, he could hear the wind picking up, rustling through the oak trees that surrounded the house. It was the same sound he had fallen asleep to as a child, a Texas lullaby that had followed him into his dreams for decades. Now it seemed to be calling him back, inviting him to discover truths that had been hidden in plain sight all his life. George took a deep breath and turned to the second page of his father's diary, ready to begin a journey into the past that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the man who had shaped his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The second entry in his father's journal was dated a week later, and George could feel the excitement and hope radiating from the words, even 60 years after they had been written. Got a call from Billy Martinez today about that recording session in Houston. He says the producer liked the demo tape I sent and wants to hear more of my songs. Doris thinks I'm crazy for even considering it. We've got the ranch to run and a new baby to feed, but I can't shake the feeling that this might be my chance. I've been writing music since I was 15, and maybe, just maybe, it's time to see if all those late nights with my guitar were worth something. George felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. His father had been offered a recording contract. This was information that had never been shared with him, never even hinted at during all those years they had spent together on this very ranch. He continued reading, his curiosity now overwhelming any concerns about privacy. January 15th, 1963, made the trip to Houston yesterday. The studio was smaller than I imagined, but when I walked in and saw those microphones and mixing boards, I felt like I was seeing the gates of heaven. Played 3 of my songs for them: Texas Moonlight, Cowboy's Last Ride, and Love Left in the Dust. The producer, a man named Frank Coleman, said I had authentic storytelling and a voice that could make women cry and men believe. They want me to come back next month with 5 more songs. George set the journal down for a moment, overwhelmed by this revelation. His father had been pursuing a music career at the exact same time George was taking his first steps and saying his first words. The man who had always seemed so rooted to the ranch, so committed to the practical realities of farming and cattle raising, had harbored the same dreams that would later drive his son to Nashville and beyond. February 20th, 1963. Things are getting complicated. Doris is pregnant again and the ranch is struggling financially. We lost 12 head of cattle to that cold snap last month, and the feed bills are piling up. Frank called yesterday asking when I'm coming back to Houston, but I don't see how I can justify spending money on gas and hotel rooms when we can barely keep up with the mortgage. Sometimes I lie awake at night hearing melodies in my head, but when morning comes, it's all about fixing fences and feeding animals. The entries continued through 1963 and into 1964, and George could see his father's dream slowly being strangled by the demands of reality. There were more references to financial pressures, to sleepless nights worrying about making ends meet, and to the growing difficulty of pursuing music while raising a family and maintaining a ranch. March 10th, 1964. Had to sell my good guitar today. The Martin that my daddy gave me when I turned 18, got $150 for it, which will help with the hospital bills from when George Jr. was born. Doris cried when she saw me come home without it. She knows what that guitar meant to me, knows it was my connection to something bigger than this daily grind. But she also knows we had no choice. Sometimes being a man means making the hard decisions, even when they break your heart. George felt tears stinging his eyes as he read about his father selling the guitar. He remembered his father playing music when he was very young, but by the time George was old enough to really pay attention, his father's musical moments had become rare and brief. Now he understood why. June 5th, 1965. Got a letter from Frank Coleman yesterday. He says the country music business is exploding, and he still believes I could make it if I'd commit to trying. He's offering to front me the money for a proper recording session and to help me get bookings at clubs around Texas. All I'd have to do is leave the ranch for a few months, maybe a year, to really give it a shot. I stared at that letter for hours after Doris and the boys went to bed. I can see myself on those stages, hear the applause, imagine people singing along to songs I wrote. But then I look at my family sleeping peacefully, trusting me to provide for them, and I know I can't risk everything on a dream. The next entry wasn't dated until 3 months later, and George could see that the decision had been made. September 12th, 1965. Sent Frank a letter today telling him I can't take his offer. Wrote it 3 times before I found the words that didn't make me sound like a coward. Told him I appreciate everything he's done, but my family has to come first. He'll probably think I'm crazy for walking away from a chance like this, and maybe I am. But when I look at little George playing with his toy horses and John Jr. taking his first steps, I know I'm making the right choice. Some dreams are worth sacrificing for something more important. George had to stop reading and walk to the window. The pasture spread out before him, brown grass waving in the October breeze, and he tried to imagine his father as a young man, standing in this same spot, watching his musical dreams disappear in service of his family's needs. The weight of that sacrifice was staggering. When he returned to the journal, the entries became less frequent, but more reflective. His father wrote about watching George show interest in music, about buying him his first guitar when he turned 12, about feeling a mixture of pride and fear when his son began performing at local venues. April 3rd, 1972, George played at the school talent show tonight. Sang Your Cheatin' Heart like he'd been performing all his life. The whole auditorium was quiet while he played, and when he finished, the applause went on for a full minute. Doris grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. She knew what I was thinking, that maybe my boy would get the chances I never had. After the show, George asked me if I thought he was good enough to be a real singer someday. I told him he was good enough to be anything he wanted to be, but inside I was praying he'd have the courage I didn't have when it counted. The entries through George's teenage years chronicled his father's growing awareness that his son possessed not just talent, but the kind of drive and determination that might actually lead somewhere. John Byron wrote about attending George's performances at local honky-tonks, about the pride he felt watching his son command a stage, and about the difficult conversations with Doris about whether to encourage or discourage their son's musical ambitions. October 15th, 1975, George graduated from high school today and says he wants to join the army. Part of me is relieved. Military service will give him structure and maybe help him think about something other than music for a while. But another part of me knows this is just delaying the inevitable. The boy has music in his blood, just like I did. The difference is he might actually have the guts to do something about it. Reading about his father's perspective on his decision to join the army was fascinating for George. He had always thought of his military service as a way to mature and gain some life experience before deciding what to do next. He hadn't realized his father saw it as a test of his commitment to music. June 20th, 1979, George got married to Norma today. Beautiful ceremony at the church in Pearsall. During the father-son dance at the reception, he told me he's serious about trying to make it in music. Says he's been writing songs while he was stationed in Hawaii, and that Norma believes in him enough to move to Nashville, if that's what it takes. I looked into his eyes and saw the same fire I used to feel, but stronger. Maybe what I couldn't do, he can. The journal entries about George's early career were filled with a mixture of vicarious excitement and parental worry. John Byron wrote about getting phone calls from George in Nashville, about hearing his songs on local radio stations, about the pride he felt when his son started getting recognition in the country music community. March 8th, 1981, Unwound hit the top 10 today. George called to tell us, and I could hear the excitement in his voice, even over the long-distance static. After I hung up the phone, I went out to the barn and just stood there for a while, thinking about all those nights I spent writing songs that nobody ever heard. It doesn't hurt like I thought it would. Instead, I feel like maybe all those dreams I gave up weren't wasted after all. Maybe they were just passed down. As George continued reading, he began to understand that his father's journal wasn't just a record of personal dreams deferred, but a chronicle of how love could transform sacrifice into something beautiful. Every entry about his son's success was filled with joy that seemed pure and without resentment, but there were also entries that revealed struggles George had never known about. Financial difficulties that his parents had hidden from him, health scares that they had downplayed, and moments of doubt about whether they had made the right choices. November 30th, 1985. Doctor says the pain in my back is from all those years of hard ranch work. Says I'll need surgery if it gets much worse. Haven't told George. He's got enough on his mind with his career taking off. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd taken Frank's offer all those years ago. Would I be the one with back problems from carrying guitar cases instead of feed sacks? But then I remember that if I had chosen differently, George might never have existed. Or if he had, he might not have had the stability he needed to chase his own dreams. The afternoon was turning into evening by the time George reached the final entries in his father's journal. The last one was dated just a few months before John Byron's death in 2009. January 10th, 2009, watched George on the CMA Awards last night. When he won Entertainer of the Year, the camera caught him wiping away a tear, and I knew he was thinking about all the people who helped him get there. I hope he knows that every song he sings carries a little bit of all the songs I never got to sing. That's not a sad thing. It's the most beautiful thing I can imagine. A father's greatest success isn't what he accomplishes for himself, but what he makes possible for his children. George closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness of his childhood bedroom, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't quite name. For decades, he had carried a vague sense of guilt about his success, feeling somehow that he had gotten lucky, while others just as talented had been overlooked. Now he understood that his path to success had been built on his father's sacrifice, that every stage he had conquered and every song he had sung had been made possible by a man who had chosen family over personal dreams. But more than that, he realized that his father hadn't seen that choice as a sacrifice at all. In John Byron Strait's mind, watching his son achieve the dreams he had given up was a greater success than anything he could have accomplished on his own. As the first stars appeared in the Texas sky outside his window, George understood that he had inherited more than just musical talent from his father. He had inherited a legacy of love so deep that it could transform personal disappointment into generational triumph. Tomorrow he would need to call Norma and tell her about this discovery. He would need to share these revelations with his own children and help them understand the grandfather they had known as a quiet rancher in a completely new light. But tonight he would sit with his father's words and let them change him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. George barely slept that night. He had moved downstairs to his father's old recliner, the journal resting on his lap as he stared out the living room window at the star-filled Texas sky. Every few hours, he would turn on the lamp and reread passages, each time discovering new layers of meaning in his father's carefully chosen words. By dawn, he had made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He needed to call his family and share this discovery, but he also needed to understand it more fully himself. He drove into town to buy supplies and spend a few days at the ranch, going through everything in that wooden chest more carefully. At Henderson's general store, where he had bought candy as a child, Martha Henderson recognized him immediately, despite the early hour and his disheveled appearance. "George Strait. Well, I'll be. Haven't seen you around these parts in ages," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. "How are you holding up, honey? I know it's been hard, losing your daddy and all." "I'm doing all right, Mrs. Henderson. Just spending some time at the old place, going through Dad's things," George replied, loading his basket with coffee, bread, and other essentials. Your daddy was a good man, George. Don't know if you know this, but he used to come in here every week and buy groceries for the Williams family when Tom was out of work. Never said a word about it, never wanted any credit. That's the kind of man John Byron was. George paused in his shopping. Another piece of his father's character that had been kept private, another act of quiet generosity that spoke to the man's heart. I didn't know that, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you for telling me. He was proud of you, you know, real proud. Every time one of your songs came on the radio, he'd turn it up, and that stern face of his would just light up. That's my boy, he'd say, every single time. Driving back to the ranch with Mrs. Henderson's words echoing in his mind, George felt the weight of his discovery growing heavier. It wasn't just about his father's abandoned musical dreams anymore. It was about a pattern of selflessness that had defined the man's entire life. Back at the house, George spread the contents of the wooden chest across the kitchen table, where he had eaten countless meals as a child. The photographs told a story he was seeing clearly for the first time. His father as a young performer, confident and talented. His father as a young husband and father, that confidence transforming into determination. His father as an older man, that determination settling into quiet contentment. The sheet music revealed perhaps the most surprising aspect of his discovery. These weren't amateur attempts at songwriting. These were sophisticated compositions with complex chord progressions and lyrics that demonstrated real poetic sensibility. George found himself humming the melodies, imagining how they might have sounded if they had ever been recorded. One song in particular caught his attention. It was titled "The Road I Didn't Take," and the lyrics seemed to speak directly to his father's experience. There was a highway calling out my name, promising fortune, promising fame, but love built a fence around my heart, said this is where your journey starts. I chose the narrow path instead, where responsibility led. And though I sometimes wonder still about that road beyond the hill, I've got no regrets to carry home, 'cause the seeds I planted here have grown into something bigger than my dreams, into something more than it seems. The road I didn't take led on, but the road I chose led to my son. George had to set the paper down and walk outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle lowing in a neighbor's pasture. He found himself standing in the exact spot where his father used to park his old Ford truck, and for a moment he could almost see the ghost of the man who had shaped his life in ways he was only now beginning to understand. His phone rang, interrupting his reverie. It was Norma, his wife of over 40 years, calling from their home in San Antonio. "Morning, honey. How's the old place treating you?" Her voice was warm and familiar, an anchor in the storm of emotions he was experiencing. "Norma, I found something yesterday. Something that changes everything I thought I knew about Dad." George's voice was thick with emotion, and Norma immediately picked up on it. "What kind of something? Are you all right?" George told her about the journal, about the photographs and sheet music, about the dreams his father had abandoned and the reasons why. Norma listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of surprise or sympathy. "Oh, George," she said when he finished, "that explains so much. Do you remember when we first got married, how your dad would sometimes get this distant look when music came on the radio? I always wondered about that." "I never noticed," George admitted. "I was so focused on my own career, my own dreams. I never stopped to think about what he might have given up. That's because he didn't want you to think about it, honey. That was the whole point. He wanted you to chase your dreams without the burden of knowing what it had cost him." George walked back into the house, carrying the phone with him. "Norma, there's something else. Some of these songs he wrote, they're really good. I mean, really good. If he had pursued this, he might have been successful." Then why does that make you sound so sad? Because it means his sacrifice was even bigger than I thought. He didn't just give up a hobby or a passing fancy. He gave up what could have been a real career, maybe even a successful one. Norma was quiet for a moment before responding. George, honey, you're thinking about this all wrong. Your daddy didn't lose anything by making that choice. He gained something. He gained the satisfaction of watching his son achieve everything he had dreamed of and more. In his mind, that wasn't a sacrifice. That was a victory. After hanging up with Norma, George returned to the journal and read the entries with fresh eyes. His wife was right. As his father wrote about George's career milestones, there was no bitterness, no sense of loss. Instead, there was joy, pride, and a deep satisfaction that seemed to grow stronger with each of his son's successes. May 15th, 1986. George's album went gold today. Gold! I remember when the highlight of my musical ambitions was playing for 30 people at the VFW Hall on Saturday nights. My boy is selling hundreds of thousands of records to people all over the country. People who have never been to Texas, never seen a real ranch, are singing along to songs about our way of life because George makes it real for them. That's not just success. That's a kind of magic. George spent the afternoon going through more boxes in the attic, now understanding what to look for. He found more photographs, including several of his father performing at local venues in the early 1960s. In one picture, John Byron was on stage at what looked like a honky-tonk, his face animated as he sang into an old microphone. The audience was small but attentive, and George could see in his father's posture the same stage presence he had inherited. There were also letters, responses to demos his father had sent to record labels, most of them polite rejections, but a few showing real interest. One letter from a Nashville publisher, dated 1964, expressed enthusiasm for his father's songwriting and asked him to come to Tennessee for a meeting. The letter was worn from handling, as if his father had read it many times, but there was no indication he had ever responded. As the sun began to set on his second day at the ranch, George made another discovery that hit him even harder than the journal. Hidden in the back of his father's bedroom closet, behind clothes that hadn't been disturbed in years, he found a guitar case. Inside was a beautiful acoustic guitar, well-maintained and obviously cherished. A small tag tied to the tuning pegs read, "For George, Christmas, 1980, Love Dad." George's hands trembled as he lifted the guitar from its case. It was a Martin D28, the same model his father had been forced to sell in 1964. His father had somehow managed to buy another one, probably at considerable expense, intending to give it to George for Christmas 25 years ago. But George had been in Nashville that Christmas, busy with his career, unable to make it home for the holidays. The guitar was perfectly tuned, as if his father had maintained it all these years, waiting for the right moment to present his gift. George strummed a chord and was amazed at the instrument's rich, warm tone. This wasn't just any guitar. This was a guitar chosen by someone who understood quality and had probably saved for months to afford it. Attached to the inside of the case was an envelope with George's name written in his father's careful script. Inside was a letter dated December 20th, 1980. "Son, I wanted to give you this guitar for Christmas, but I know you're busy with your career and probably have better instruments than an old rancher could afford. I bought this one to replace the Martin I had to sell when you were little. I thought maybe someday we could play together, you on your fancy guitars and me on this old thing. But I realize now that your music has grown beyond anything I could add to. That's as it should be. This guitar will wait here until you're ready for it, until maybe you want to remember the simple music we used to make on the front porch before the world knew your name. I'm proud of you, son, prouder than you'll ever know. Love, Dad." George sat on his father's bed, holding the guitar and crying for the first time since his father's funeral. All those Christmases when he had been too busy to come home, all those phone calls cut short because he had studio time or meetings or interviews. His father had been waiting patiently, holding on to this gift and this dream of playing music together, never pressuring him, never making him feel guilty for his absence. The weight of missed opportunities was crushing, but as George played a few more chords on the guitar, he began to hear something else in its voice. It wasn't just sadness, it was love. This instrument had been chosen and maintained as an act of faith, a belief that someday there would be time for the simple pleasure of making music together, father and son. As darkness fell over the ranch, George carried the guitar downstairs and sat in his father's chair, playing softly and thinking about all the conversations they would never have. But he also thought about all the conversations they had had, seeing them now through the lens of his new understanding. Every word of encouragement, every expression of pride, every quiet moment of support took on deeper meaning now that he understood the sacrifice that had made his success possible. Tomorrow, he would call his children and share this story with them. He would help them understand their grandfather, not just as the quiet rancher they had known, but as a man whose dreams had been transformed into something larger through his love for his family. Tonight, though, he would sit with his father's guitar and his father's words, letting them change him in ways that would echo through the rest of his life. The third morning at the ranch brought an unexpected visitor. George was sitting on the front porch with his father's guitar, playing Amarillo Morning and watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, when he heard a truck coming down the gravel drive. It was Tom Williams, whose family had been neighbors for 40 years. Tom climbed out of his Ford pickup, moving slowly as his arthritic knees protested the movement. He was about George's age, with weathered hands and the kind of deep tan that came from a lifetime of outdoor work. "Morning, George. Martha Henderson at the store mentioned you were out here. Hope you don't mind me dropping by." "Not at all, Tom. Good to see you. Coffee's fresh if you want some." Tom settled into one of the old rocking chairs that had been on the porch since George was a child. "That's a beautiful guitar you got there. Reminds me of one your daddy used to have way back when." George looked up sharply. "You remember Dad playing guitar?" "Oh, hell yes. Your daddy was quite the musician back in the day. Used to play at the Broken Wheel on Saturday nights, sometimes over at the VFW. This would have been early 60s, before you were old enough to remember. Man could make that guitar sing, I tell you what." Tom's confirmation of his father's musical abilities felt like another piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "Did he ever talk to you about wanting to make a career of it?" Tom was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly and studying George's face. "He did, actually. I remember one night, must have been 1963 or 64, we were having a beer after he played at the Wheel, and he told me he'd gotten some interest from folks in Houston. Said there was a producer wanted to work with him, maybe help him make a real go of it." "What did you tell him?" "I told him he'd be crazy not to try. Hell, he was better than most of what we heard on the radio back then. Had his own style, you know, not trying to copy anybody else." Tom paused and looked out across the pasture. But then he got quiet and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Tom, I got 2 little boys who need their daddy home every night. A man's got to choose what matters most, and my family matters more than any dream." George felt his throat tighten. Did he ever seem to regret that choice? Never, not once. And believe me, I watched for it. You know how men can get bitter when they feel like life passed them by. But your daddy, the prouder you made him, the happier he seemed. Like watching you succeed was better than anything he could have done himself. Tom reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Matter of fact, that's why I came by today. Found this in my attic when the wife was making me clean up there. Thought you might want it." It was a photograph George had never seen before. It showed his father on stage, at what must have been the Broken Wheel, guitar in hand, mid-song. But what struck George was the expression on his father's face, pure joy, completely lost in the music. In the background, barely visible, was a young Tom Williams at a table with his wife, both of them watching with obvious admiration. "He loved it," George said softly, studying the photograph. "He sure did, but you know what? I think he loved being your daddy even more. When you started getting famous, John Byron would bring your albums to the cafe in town and play them for anybody who'd listen. 'That's my boy,' he'd say. 'That's my George,' like he'd won the lottery every single time." After Tom left, George spent the morning walking the property with his father's guitar. He visited the old barn where he had first learned to play, the creek where he used to sit and write songs as a teenager, and the hilltop where his father used to take him to watch the sunset. Each place held memories that now carried new weight and meaning. At midday, his phone rang. It was his son, George Jr., calling from his own ranch outside San Antonio. "Dad, Mom told me about what you found out there. Are you okay?" "I'm processing it all, son. It's a lot to take in. Do you want some company? I could drive out this afternoon." George considered the offer. Part of him wanted to work through this discovery alone, but another part recognized that this story was bigger than just his relationship with his father. This was about family legacy, about understanding where they all came from. "Actually, yes, I'd like that. And call your sister too. Ask if she wants to drive out from Austin. I think this is something we should all hear together." "Already ahead of you. Jennifer's with me. We've been talking about Grandpa all morning. Mom said he was a musician before he was a rancher?" "He was, son. And from what I'm learning, he was a damn good one." George Jr. and Jennifer arrived in the late afternoon, pulling up to the house in George Jr.'s truck, just as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon. Jennifer hugged her father tightly, and George could see concern in both his children's eyes. "Dad, you look like you haven't slept in days," Jennifer said, studying his face. "This has really shaken you up, hasn't it?" "It has, but maybe in a good way. Come on inside. I want to show you what I found." George led his children to the kitchen table where he had arranged the contents of the wooden chest. He watched their faces as they examined the photographs, read through some of the sheet music, and handled their grandfather's journal with the reverence it deserved. "I can't believe Grandpa never told us about this," George Jr. said, looking at a photograph of his grandfather performing. "He looks so, I don't know, alive. Different from how I remember him." "He didn't want us to know," George explained. "At least, not until we were old enough to understand what it meant, and maybe not even then." Jennifer was reading one of the songs her grandfather had written, her lips moving silently as she worked through the lyrics. "Dad, these are really good. This one about the road I didn't take. It's beautiful and sad. Read it out loud, honey. I want your brother to hear it." As Jennifer read their grandfather's lyrics aloud, George watched his son's face change. George Jr. had always been practical like his grandfather, more interested in ranching than music, but even he could hear the poetry and emotion in those carefully crafted words. "He gave up all this for us," George Jr. said when Jennifer finished reading. "For you, and because of that for us too." "That's what I've been trying to understand," George replied. "Whether it was really a sacrifice or if it was something else entirely." They spent the evening going through more of the journal entries, with George reading passages aloud that seemed particularly significant. His children asked questions about their grandfather that George realized he had never thought to ask when the man was alive. What had his dreams been? What had made him happy? What had he feared? The journal provided answers to some of these questions, but it also raised new ones. As the night grew later and they sat around the kitchen table where John Byron Strait had eaten thousands of meals, George began to see a larger pattern in his father's life. "You know what I'm starting to understand," George said, looking at his children in the lamplight. Your grandfather didn't see his life as a series of sacrifices. He saw it as a series of choices, and he was proud of the choices he made. But don't you think he ever wondered what might have been? Jennifer asked. Don't you think there were nights when he heard you on the radio and thought about what his own career could have been? George picked up the Martin guitar and strummed a few chords before answering. Maybe. But if he did, I think he decided that what actually happened was better than what might have been. Look at this entry from 1987. He found the page and read aloud. George won his first Grammy tonight, watched it on TV with Dorothy, and when they called his name, I felt like my heart might explode with pride. I thought about that letter from the Nashville publisher 20 years ago, about the road I didn't take. But sitting here tonight, watching my son accept that award, I know I took the right road. Some dreams are worth giving up, so that better dreams can come true. George Jr. was quiet for a long moment before speaking. I think I understand what you're getting at, Dad. Grandpa didn't lose his dreams. He passed them on. Exactly, and they became something bigger than what he could have achieved alone. Jennifer picked up one of the photographs showing her grandfather as a young performer. I wish I could have seen him play. I wish I could have known this side of him. Maybe you can, George said, an idea beginning to form in his mind. I've been thinking about something all day. These songs he wrote, they're good enough to be heard. They deserve to be heard. What are you suggesting? George Jr. asked. I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to finish what your grandfather started, not to replace what I've done, but to honor what he gave up. Maybe record some of these songs, play them for people, let the world know that John Byron Strait was more than just a rancher from Texas. The idea energized all three of them. They spent the next hour planning how they might approach such a project. George could record the songs himself, or perhaps work with other artists to bring his father's compositions to life. They could create a documentary about the man behind the music, exploring the relationship between dreams deferred and dreams fulfilled. There's something else, George said, as they began to wrap up their evening together. I found a guitar in Dad's closet. A Martin D28 he bought for me in 1980, but never got the chance to give me. It came with a letter saying he hoped we could play together someday. Both of his children were visibly moved by this revelation. Oh, Dad, Jennifer said softly, all those Christmases when you couldn't make it home. He was waiting, George finished. Waiting patiently, never making me feel guilty, never pressuring me, just waiting. George Jr. stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. You know what we should do? We should have that session. Not just record his songs, but play them together. All of us. Make it a family thing. I'd like that, George said. I'd like that very much. As his children prepared to drive back to San Antonio, George walked them to their truck. The night air was cool and filled with the sounds of rural Texas. Crickets chirping, a distant coyote howling, the whisper of wind through the oak trees. Dad, Jennifer said as she hugged him goodbye, are you going to be okay out here by yourself? I think so, honey. I think I need one more night to sit with all this, to really let it sink in. After they left, George returned to the front porch with his father's guitar. He played softly in the darkness, working through some of the melodies his father had written, trying to imagine how they might have sounded if they had been recorded decades ago. But more than that, he was thinking about the legacy he wanted to leave for his own children and grandchildren. His father had shown him that success wasn't just about achieving your own dreams, but about making it possible for others to achieve theirs. That love could transform sacrifice into something beautiful, and that sometimes the greatest victory was watching someone else cross the finish line. As he played his father's songs under the Texas stars, George began to understand that he had inherited more than just musical talent. He had inherited a way of looking at life that valued family over fame, love over ambition, and the long view over immediate gratification. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of sharing his father's music with the world. But tonight, he would sit in the place where it all began, playing songs that had waited 40 years to be heard, finally understanding the man who had shaped his life in ways he was only now beginning to appreciate. George woke before dawn on his final morning at the ranch, the guitar still resting across his lap where he had fallen asleep in his father's chair. The house was quiet, except for the familiar sounds of an old building settling and the distant lowing of cattle in neighboring pastures. For a moment, he felt disoriented, caught between the present and all the memories that had been stirred up over the past few days. But as consciousness returned fully, he felt something he hadn't expected: peace. The weight of his discovery was still there, but it no longer felt crushing. Instead, it felt like a gift he had been meant to receive exactly when he was ready for it. His phone buzzed with a text message from Norma. "Coffee's on at home when you're ready. Take all the time you need, but don't forget you have people who love you here too." George smiled as he read the message. His wife understood, as she always had, that he needed to process this discovery in his own way and his own time. But she also knew him well enough to remind him that his own family needed him present, not lost in the past. He made one final tour of the house, this time not looking for more hidden treasures, but simply saying goodbye to the place that had shaped him. In the kitchen, he paused at the table where he had eaten breakfast as a child, where he had done homework as a teenager, where his father had sat every morning reading the paper and planning the day's work on the ranch. In the living room, he stood for a long moment in front of the photograph of himself at 16, holding his first real guitar. His father's hand on his shoulder seemed to carry new meaning now, not just pride in his son's talent, but a kind of passing of the torch, a silent benediction that said, "This is yours now. Make it count." Before leaving, George carefully packed the wooden chest with all of its contents. The journal, the photographs, the sheet music, and the guitar, all of it was coming home with him. But more than that, the understanding he had gained about his father, about sacrifice and love, and the way dreams could be transformed rather than abandoned, was coming with him too. The drive back to San Antonio felt different than the drive out had. 3 days ago, he had been a successful musician visiting his childhood home. Now, he was a son who finally understood the depth of his father's love and the magnitude of what had been given up to make his success possible. At home, Norma was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of smile that had sustained their marriage through 40 years of challenges and changes. She didn't ask questions immediately, just let him settle into the chair beside hers and drink his coffee while he found the words he needed. "I understand him now," George finally said. "Not completely, maybe never completely, but enough to see that he wasn't a man who gave up his dreams. He was a man who found a way to make his dreams bigger than himself." Norma reached over and took his hand. "That's what love does, George. It takes what we want for ourselves and transforms it into what we want for the people we care about." Over the following weeks, George threw himself into a project that felt more important than anything he had done in his career. Working with longtime producer Tony Brown, he began the process of bringing his father's songs to life. Some he recorded himself, trying to capture not just the melodies and lyrics, but the spirit of the man who had written them. Others he shared with fellow artists who understood the significance of what they were being asked to preserve. Keith Whitley's widow, Lorrie Morgan, was particularly moved by "The Road I Didn't Take" and asked if she could record it as a duet with George. The song, which spoke to choices made for love rather than ambition, resonated with her own understanding of sacrifice and family. Alan Jackson, who had always admired George's traditional approach to country music, was eager to record "Texas Moonlight." one of the songs John Byron had originally planned to include in his Houston recording session. "This is pure country," Jackson said after hearing the demo, "the kind of songwriting that made this genre what it is." But the most meaningful collaboration came from an unexpected source. George Jr., who had never shown much interest in performing despite his musical heritage, asked if he could join his father in recording Cowboy's Last Ride, one of the most personal songs in his grandfather's collection. "I'm not much of a singer," George Jr. admitted as they worked in the studio, "but I feel like Grandpa would want a member of the family to be part of this." The recording session became an emotional experience for both men. As they worked through the song, which told the story of an aging cowboy passing his wisdom to the next generation, George felt the presence of his father in the room. It was as if 3 generations of straight men were finally making music together, connected across time by love and shared understanding. The album, titled "The Road I Didn't Take: Songs by John Byron Strait," was released 6 months after George's discovery at the ranch. It wasn't a commercial project in the traditional sense. George donated all proceeds to a scholarship fund for young musicians from rural communities who needed financial help to pursue their dreams. The critical response was overwhelmingly positive. Music journalists praised not just the quality of the songs, but the story behind them. Rolling Stone called it a masterpiece of family legacy, while country music television produced a documentary about the project that won several awards. But for George, the most meaningful response came from the listeners. Letters poured in from fans who shared their own stories of family sacrifice, of dreams deferred for the sake of love, of parents who had given up their own ambitions to make their children's dreams possible. One letter from a woman in Oklahoma particularly moved him. "My daddy was a painter who gave up his art to work in a factory so I could go to college. He never complained, never made me feel guilty, just like your daddy never did to you." Hearing these songs made me understand that his sacrifice wasn't a loss. It was love in action. Thank you for helping me see that. The project also brought George's family closer together in unexpected ways. Jennifer, inspired by her grandfather's example, began working with a non-profit organization that provided music education to underserved communities. George Jr. started a program on his ranch that brought inner-city children out to experience rural life and learn about agriculture, much as his grandfather had taught him. But perhaps the most significant change was in George himself. The guilt he had carried for years about his success, the feeling that he had somehow been lucky while others just as talented had been overlooked, was replaced by a deeper understanding of how success really worked. It wasn't just about individual talent or determination. It was about the network of love and support that made achievement possible. A year after finding his father's journal, George returned to the ranch one more time. The property had been donated to the Texas Historical Society, with the stipulation that it be preserved as a working ranch and used to educate young people about agricultural life and the importance of family legacy. Standing on the front porch, where his father had spent countless evenings, George played some of the songs from the album on the Martin guitar that had waited so long to be given. A small crowd had gathered. Local residents, music fans, and members of his extended family who had come to hear these songs performed in the place where they had been written. As he played "The Road I Didn't Take," George looked out at the faces in the audience and saw his own journey reflected back at him. There were young people who were struggling with their own difficult choices between dreams and responsibility. There were parents who were making sacrifices for their children's futures. There were older people who were looking back on their own lives and trying to understand the meaning of the choices they had made. When he finished the song, the applause was gentle and respectful, the kind of response that acknowledged something sacred had been shared. George set the guitar aside and spoke to the gathered crowd. My father wrote these songs in the 1960s, when he was a young man with dreams of his own. He never got to perform them for an audience like this, never got to see people respond to his music the way you just did. But I think he would have been proud, not because his songs were finally being heard, but because they were being used to bring people together, to help us understand something important about love and family and the choices we make for each other. He paused, looking out at the pasture where he had played as a child, where his father had worked every day to build a life for his family. The road he didn't take led to fortune and fame and individual success. The road he chose led to something much more valuable. It led to a legacy that would outlast any career, any achievement, any recognition the world could offer. It led to love that could transform sacrifice into joy, disappointment into fulfillment, and dreams deferred into dreams multiplied. As the sun set over the ranch that evening, George packed his father's guitar one more time and prepared to return to his own life, his own family, his own responsibilities. But he was taking with him more than just a musical instrument and a collection of songs. He was taking a new understanding of what it meant to be successful, what it meant to be a father, and what it meant to love someone so deeply that their dreams became more important than your own. The drive home was peaceful, filled with the kind of contentment that comes from finally understanding something that had been mysterious for too long. George thought about his father's words from the journal. Some dreams are worth giving up so that better dreams can come true. Now he understood that John Byron Strait hadn't given up his dreams at all. He had planted them like seeds in the fertile soil of his son's life, and they had grown into something bigger and more beautiful than anything he could have achieved alone. The music he had never recorded had been recorded by his son. The stages he had never played had been played by his son. The recognition he had never received had been received by his son, and in that achievement, his own dreams had found their truest fulfillment. As George pulled into his driveway in San Antonio, he saw Norma waiting on the porch, just as she had been waiting all those years ago when he would return from tours and recording sessions. But now he understood something about that waiting that had escaped him before. It wasn't just patience or support. It was love in action, the same kind of love his father had shown by choosing family over fame, responsibility over recognition. "Welcome home," Norma said as he climbed the steps to their porch. "Thank you," George replied, and for the first time in his life, he understood the full weight of what those words meant. Home wasn't just a place you returned to. It was a place built by the sacrifices of people who loved you enough to make your dreams more important than their own. That night, as George sat in his own living room surrounded by his own family, he played his father's songs one more time. But now they didn't sound like music that had been lost and found. They sounded like music that had always been there, woven into the fabric of his life, giving melody and meaning to everything he had ever achieved. The road John Byron Strait didn't take had led his son to glory. But the road he chose had led to something even more precious, a legacy of love that would echo through generations. A understanding that true success wasn't measured in individual achievement, but in the dreams you made possible for others. And the knowledge that sometimes the greatest song a man could write was the life he lived for the people he loved. In the end, George realized, his father had gotten everything he had ever dreamed of. It had just come to him in a way he had never expected, through the success of the son who carried his genes, his values, and now, finally, his music into a world that was ready to hear the true meaning of both sacrifice and love.